Good evening, everyone. How are we feeling? Good. So, sorry about that. We're gonna just slightly adjust that so it's a little less whiny. We love that. All right, welcome, welcome. Did you do a little international? Ooh, okay. And with that, we're going to actually get to hear a lot more about you. Wow. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce George Wilson to the stage to do the longer, nicer, prettier introduction for you all.
Thank you, Lord. Do I really need the microphone, everybody? No. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and Bobcats all. Welcome. My name is George Wilson. I'm the president of your Ohio University Alumni Association Ebony Bobcat Network DC affiliate. And I'd like to welcome our fellow Bobcat and colleague, Mr. Gregory T, as Lori had pointed out, who's going to be talking about his book tonight, Beyond the Voting Rights Act, and his book signed. So we welcome Greg. Okay. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. We really appreciate your coming out and being in attendance here for Greg and Carl's activity. And we want to thank Ms. Lori Baronites Sanchez and her team for Busboys and Poets for their support, their sponsorship, and promotion of this event this evening. Thank you all very much. We couldn't have done it without. Shanara is our server, so please let's give her lots of work to do. As I look around this room, I can see some of you, like me, were around and remember when President Lyndon Baines Johnson actually signed the initial Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965, intending to end discriminatory voting practices in America. This evening, we'll explore the changes which have diluted the Voting Rights Act since those long ago days of the Great Society through conversation led by another distinguished Bobcat, Mr. Carl Chancellor, and your question and answer. Without further ado, please allow me to draw your attention to our author, Mr. Gregory T, as he comes to the stage. And our conversation partner for the evening, Pulitzer Prize winner, Mr. Carl Chancellor. For those of you from the Cleveland area, you will recognize these two fighting eagles of Kennedy High School in Cleveland. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Brother Chancellor.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Any echo?
No.
Okay, great. Well, first off, thank you for coming out tonight. I'm excited to host this event with a distinguished OU Bobcat and fellow Clevelander. I'm going to try to make this more of a conversation today, so we're just going to talk about the Voting Rights Act and some of the events that you've lived through and can share with us. And also, we're going to open it up to questions and answers in some period. So without further ado, let me get started.
All right.
The concept of American democracy, one man, one vote, was one of the first tenets of our Declaration of Independence. Yet, it would take the United States 128 years from the adoption of the Constitution to grant women the right to vote, 167 years to grant all African Americans the right to vote, 174 years to grant 18-year-olds to 21-year-olds the right to vote, 177 years to guarantee votes to bilingual Americans, and it would be 197 years before the United States set one national standard for registering all Americans with the passage of the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. So my general question to all of you is to think about this. What is so scary about the notion, one person, one vote? I'm honored to be here today with you, Gregory T. Moore, author of Beyond the Voting Rights Act, the untold story of the struggle to reform America's voting registration laws. As George mentioned, not only is Brother Greg a distinguished author, he's one of America's foremost voting rights advocates. He is also, as I said, a fellow Bobcat and a fellow Clevelander. And as George mentioned, he's also a fellow JFK High School Fighting Eagle. He's class of 1978. I'm class of 71. But anyway, so before we get to the untold story, Greg, can you share a bit about your backstory and how growing up in Cleveland and attending OU put you on a decades-long path of voting rights activism?
Well, first, thank you, Carl, for being here. And we just found out went to the same high school about a month ago.
Yeah.
And so we hung out on Saturday here at Busboys, and we talked a little bit about being fighting eagles. But this is a very small world. Second, I want to thank you all for coming. Now, all of the things in the world going on today, you found the time to come here tonight. So I really appreciate that. For those of you I know, thank you for reconnecting again. For those of you I don't know, it's good to meet you. Hopefully we can chat a little bit before the night is over. This journey that I've been on actually started in Cleveland, and I'll keep it brief because it could go on for a while. But both Carl and I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and the Cleveland school system at the time was a very segregated school system, where 95% of all the black people went to school on the east side, and the white students were at school on the west side. So I started my career as a high school student working on the efforts to desegregate the school system in Cleveland, as long as also the issue of education funding was big. I remember 3 separate teacher strikes when I was in high school, when schools were just closed, you couldn't go to school. Or they ran out of substitutes, we couldn't bring people in, or the custodians would go on strike. And then the school would run out of money. It was a cash flow issue because a lot of the white voters did not vote for school levies because of desegregation. They didn't support it. And so I learned to do things like working on canvassing, trying to get people to turn out and vote for school levies back when I was a teenager. And that work bled into the work that I did at Ohio University by being involved with the Student Senate, voter registration drives, Our campus was about 14,000 at the time, and we registered about 6,000 of those students. So all you Bobcats in the room know what I'm talking about. Athens, Ohio is a very tiny town in Southeast Ohio. And the fact that you could register half the campus meant we had as many students registered as there were townspeople at the time. And so that was a major movement at Ohio University. We took that statewide, did that around the state of Ohio 1982. And that was an important year. There were two things on the ballot that year. One was a initiative to knock 22% off of the state subsidy through a massive state budget cut. The other one was to keep Ohio's drinking age at 19. So I had a good time doing voter registration around the state that year. Students turned out in large numbers, and Ohio was the last state to actually go over to the 21-year-old drinking age, and that was a big issue at Ohio University. But it got people registered, it got people thinking, and got people involved. I was happy being in Athens. I wanted to go back to Cleveland, but I was asked to come to Washington, D.C. and run for a position called the U.S. Student Association, which was at the time the nation's oldest and largest national student association. It used to be called NSA, and I was elected as the first African-American president of that group that was founded in 1947. And so we did the same thing, voter registration drives across the country, but also other issues like the anti-apartheid movement was going on, the fight for a king holiday was going on. And in that era also, Jesse Jackson was running for president. And I want to talk a little bit about that a little bit later.
Thank you, thank you. Well, one thing I really loved about his book is that, because I'm a history buff, it's filled with so many behind the scenes observations about our history, civil rights, and it's filled with iconic figures such as Representative John Conyers, John Lewis, Donna Brazile, Reverend Jesse Jackson, Stephanie Tubbs Jones, and of course, Barack Obama. So, Greg, I want to know, from your point of view, what were some of your headiest moments on this long journey? Obviously, the passage of the Voter Registration Act. But also on the flip side, what are some of your greatest disappointments in this journey?
Well, let's do the positive stuff first. There were a lot of voting rights bills. In fact, my good friend Cedric Kendricks was reminding me just now, we have two Congress staffers here, in fact, Jared Holomacki and Cedric Kendricks, and they are old-time Congress staffers both from Detroit. So I have to have a Detroit reading here for a minute. But the high point was that after so many years of trying to get massive voter registration bills passed, I was able to be helpful outside of Capitol Hill by working with the Jackson campaign. He ran for president in '84 and '88. My job on the campaign, I wasn't on the campaign, I was the head of his Citizenship Education Fund. All we did was voter registration and research and voting rights advocacy. So while the campaign was going on, I was registering people to vote in all those states before the primaries happened. So when I said we were in 38 states, we were in 38 states. We actually got in the car and drove and did the work well before the campaign got there. So that's why we were able to register so many millions of people actually over that time period when he was running for president. That was the high point for me because we discovered a lot of barriers to voting that I was able to recount in this book. In fact, I should say I wrote the book because there were so many instances of my work around voting rights and barriers to voting that I decided I need to put it into a book and try to preserve some of it for historical purposes. Many of the stories in this book are not on newspaper stands, and they weren't on the evening news. These were things that happened behind the scenes. And so there were several barriers to voting we discovered. I want to talk about a few of them, but when you have a person like Jesse Jackson in the mid-'80s running for president, it was a very radical thing. And it actually caused all kinds of trouble within the Democratic Party. And so having him go around to the South and try to do voter registration, it was very difficult. So the book talks about some of the barriers that we discovered, and the barriers we discovered to voting is what made the call for a voter registration bill important back in the 1980s. And so I began this work in the 1980s, as I mentioned. And so we discovered many of the barriers through the campaign, which always existed, but they were brought to light because of that campaign. A couple of examples would be the difficulty people have with registering to vote. I can always say it better than I can read it, but there were states in the country where you couldn't get more than 25 voter registration forms at any one time. You couldn't register people on site because you had to have a registrar who was going to be present. And if the registrar didn't come, you couldn't register people to vote. So we were having all these rallies, and nobody could register. But there were several other things that was making it very difficult for us to get our people registered. And so those barriers were used as a basis for trying to put together the new bill that we were trying to do. John Conyers was an advocate for same-day voter registration, and he was one of the people who had began that drive for years. But the League of Women Voters and other groups called good government groups decided to do something a little bit more moderate, which was called the motor voter bill, basically registering people to vote when they get their driver's license. At the time, 92% of the people had driver's license, but the turnout and the voter registration list was still hovering over around 50%. So half the country was not even registered. And it became for African Americans and Latinos and young people, that number was even higher. I think African Americans are only registered about 66%. Young people around 42%. African Americans and the Latino community was even lower in the 40%. And so the barrier to voting was the registration. So we had different rules in different states. And in the state of Georgia, for instance, there was 150 counties. They all set their own rules for voter registration. Our job was to set one national standard. And so that was the reason why it helped us to get a better understanding of what was wrong. And so the process began in the 80s through the campaigns, but it took us 5 years from the 88 campaign to the 93, the election of 1992, and then the 93 presidency of Bill Clinton before any of those laws became the law. We had a Republican president, George Bush, as you know, and that was making it very difficult for us to get anything passed. But even though there was a Democratic-controlled Congress, we had Democrats and Republicans against us. They were with filibusters at the time, Southern Democrats, basically. So that was why it was complicated.
Well, you said that you have so many people.
Okay.
No closer. All right.
Sorry about that.
But you mentioned there was so many obstacles and barriers to voter registration. I was just wondering, as I guess my first question I posed, what's the problem with the notion of one person, one vote? Why are so many people against people voting?
Well, for a long time in our country's history, we had a lot of people who were excluded from the process, and that's kind of the way the country started, as we all know. If you weren't a white male landowner, you didn't have the right to vote. If you were a woman, you didn't have the right to vote. African American or any person of color, you couldn't vote. And so this has been a long, drawn-out process. And so the barriers to voting were just remnants of that, which we kind of know now. But at the time, people kind of assumed everybody had the right to vote, and people were just lazy or just uninterested in voting. I found out when I was a student at 18. I went to register to vote when I was 18 years old. Went downtown, Cleveland Public Library, jumped on the bus, and just having to walk up into an institution and ask to go vote was intimidating for an 18-year-old. It was even more intimidating if you were going to a courthouse in Athens, Ohio, and you had to go ask for a voter registration form. So we tried to change that so that more people could actually have the access to register people to vote. Postcard registration was being used in 27 states effectively. But by 1993, only 27 states you could register to vote with a postcard. People were getting arrested from Project Vote and welfare lines because they were trying to register people to vote at public agencies. They'd been arrested in Alabama and Pennsylvania and other states because you couldn't just walk into a welfare office and register people to vote. The National Voter Registration Act changed all that. It basically allowed people to register with the postcard. It stopped this practice of purging people for non-voting. You used to lose your right to vote. If you didn't use it, you would lose it. So you could be purged every 6 months in Chicago, every 2 years in most states if you didn't vote. So we were losing all these people. I was in Maryland registered to vote with Reverend Jackson. I was so proud of this 14,000 registration drive we did at the beginning of the school year. And we had press conferences. We were so happy. But then I turned my forms in, and the Prince George's County election director said, I want to show you something. He pulled out his chart and showed me that they had purged over 140,000 people just that month for non-voting. So he said, you can do all the registration you want. You'll never catch up. So what I was realizing was that, wait a minute. That means that if I fill my bucket full of votes or full of water, and there's a big hole in the bottom of the bucket, no matter what I do, it'll never be full. So that's what was happening in our country for years. And the National Voter Registration Act standardized the practice so that more people were able to vote. And once that law passed, then from 1996 to 2000, you began to see the escalation of people's voter registration. And that's what caused the problems in Florida in 2000, was the massive number of people who are now registered to vote due to this new law that had finally kicked in. If that makes any sense.
When the late, great Representative John Lewis said that the Supreme Court's 2013 Shelby County v. Holder decision, quote, put a dagger into the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Was he being dramatic and overblown?
Oh, no, not at all. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the benchmark of how Dr. King and John Lewis and others were able to secure the right to vote for many of those states in the South where they were just catching hell trying to do voter registration. What the Supreme Court did in 2013 was that they took away one of the biggest tools we had, which was the pre-clearance provision. So if your state had a record of doing voter disenfranchisement, you could be taken to court without any other steps. By you simply passing a bill or getting ready to pass a bill, you could be stopped before the bill became a law because it had to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department or a federal judge. And so when they took away the pre-clearance formula that basically said, here's how you judge which states are going to be covered, it basically took the leash off of states to start doing whatever they wanted to do. That was 2013. So all the progress we had made in the Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act, people registering to vote, the numbers getting higher. Once the Supreme Court stepped in, they stopped the ability of the civil rights community and the federal courts and the Justice Department to stop those states from putting those bills in. And that's when the escalation happened in the aftermath of the Obama election and re-election. The 2013 campaign started the downscaling of our rights to vote because states were able to do whatever they wanted to do. And we did not have Congress take the step to fix that Voting Rights Act. And that's still the case today, almost 10 years later, in 2023.
Now, you mentioned the steps to correct that. Obviously, there's the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that hasn't really gotten any traction. What are the prospects for that? Is it going to be able to get passed, or is it always going to be on the back burner for a while?
Well, we were in better shape a year ago when we had the Democrats controlling the House and the Senate. And because that's not the case now, it's less likely we'll be able to get that bill passed. And the thing about what we were trying to do was just create a new formula. It was simply trying to say, let's put a formula together that helps make sure states don't have this. Not just southern states, but states like Ohio, where I'm from, and many of you are from, and Wisconsin, and Indiana, and Missouri, who were putting these laws into place, strict photo IDs. They were putting laws into place that made it hard for people to do some of the things we're doing now. So by the time we got into the post-Florida world, we were registering people to vote, and people were voting through early voting. Instead of just voting on one day, states were allowing people to vote early vote. Like they could vote 30 days out. They were doing no fault absentee ballot. You used to have to have a reason for voting absentee. And they were also getting rid of some of the things we were doing, like drop boxes and the things like that were making it easier for people who were disabled to vote. So when they took away, when Republicans are now working to get rid of some of these things, and it's primarily Republicans, they are making it less likely that a person who have barriers will be able to still participate at the same level. So that's where we are. Mm-hmm. We're now watching states pull those rights back. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Act was designed, and actually started off as a Voting Rights Advancement Act. John Conyers, again, led the fight on that. He had a bipartisan bill called the Voting Rights Amendment Act, which basically put the bill back together again, but it also had bipartisan support. But of course, that thing fell apart. And the book goes into that detail, how we were working on trying to get the energy and attention around that. Thankfully, we had this great thing called the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And we went to Selma, I think 80,000 people showed up. President Obama was the keynote speaker. The media was all into it. It was a great experience. We followed it up with a big rally in a place called Roanoke, Virginia, where the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Bob Goodlatte, was refusing to even bring the bill up for a vote. And so we had a rally down there in June on the first anniversary of the Shelby decision, the second anniversary. And we were finally getting traction. And then in June of 2015, Donald Trump announced he's running for president. The media shifts its attention to him. Everything kind of goes in that direction. And the Congress never did get back around to getting that passed. And without that protection, many of those things that I talked about that were happening in states kept happening until 2016 that year. You know what happened then.
As you mentioned, Donald Trump, it seems like since his defeat in 2020 and the big lie that voter suppression is on steroids, I read somewhere that there have been more than 400 bills introduced across the country, basically by Republican lawmakers trying to suppress the vote. How do we get here, and what can we do at this point?
Well, it's going to be a tough road. The main thing I think we have to do is, first of all, know the history of how this worked. People are assuming that these are election deniers that Donald Trump brought it to the table. No, these are people who've been doing this for 30, 40 years. And now they've gotten more possibilities to do this because they don't have the same restrictions that the federal government used to have. These 400 laws are got to get repealed at the state level. So this battle we've been fighting in Washington has really moved to the states. Now, I've kind of disappeared from Washington for a few years. I went back to Ohio, went back and got my master's degree for the first time, which was something I wanted to do ever since I started working on the Jackson campaign. I never stopped long enough to do it. And it also allowed me to write this book because I got a chance to get back into research. But I was also seeing what the Ohio legislature was doing. And they were doing many of those same things that other states are. So we have to fight it at the state level. But second, we have to remember, people have been turning out in great numbers because of this threat. The problem is that Republicans, we are assuming that this is something that motivates our base to vote. But we can't let Republicans get off the hook saying, oh, they control the House now, so we can't get a bill. No, they have to pass this bill before the 2024 election, or we're going to have even more problems. And so I still call on Congress to pass the bill. Many of our legends like John Conyers and John Lewis and Cummings and others are gone, but we still have a good, strong set of people who believe in voting rights that are still fighting the battle, Jerry Soule and others from Selma. But to be honest with you, it's going to be tough to get that bill passed in this environment when they can't even pass a budget. And there's just a basic retrenchment of this Congress. So the fight is in the states. We have to do it state by state. And we have to make sure we do it in a timely manner before we get to the 2024 elections.
Now, you mentioned your OU experience registering young people, college students to vote. And it seems like at least in 2008 and 2012, the youth vote was a big determinant in getting Barack Obama in the White House. Do you still see the same energy in young people as far as voting? And if not, what we need to do for that?
Well, I do see that energy, but my only concern is that people may be impatient with this process. It's hard to pass these laws and it's hard to repeal these laws. I started working on the National Voter Registration Act in 1988, and we didn't get it passed until 1993. We had to go through 4 filibusters, 1 presidential veto. It was tough, but we kept coming back. I don't know if that energy is there for people to say, okay, well, we lost. I guess it's over. We have to keep going. So young people have tools we didn't have. Nothing in this book. If you read it, you'll see that we didn't have the internet. We didn't have, even text messaging. We didn't have most of the social media apparatus that we have today. Those things have been helpful, also hurtful, because it also polarizes the country so that people feel like they can just, do this whole thing on social media. Cedric and Jared and others know that we did this stuff in rooms, in committee rooms on Capitol Hill. You had to sit down with Republican and work through some of these bills and language. Language would take forever. So that's what we didn't really appreciate so much. Now, I'm not sure how people work on Capitol Hill if it's virtual for the most part the last couple of years, but it's been tough to see how the polarization that's in the country now will allow such a bill like this to even be passed. But we're gonna keep trying.
As you say, you want to keep trying. You've been doing this for 30 years. Personally, what keeps you going?
I have a lot of energy. I don't know what that is. I'm not using it to do the track runs or nothing, but I am using it to keep fighting. My fight's been in Ohio the last few years, but many people of you in this room, you're here because you have an interest in this issue. That gives me confidence and hope. But also, there were things that I didn't think were ever going to happen that did happen while we were passing these laws. There were all types of barriers we had to getting things done. But when I saw that the way Reverend Jackson fought to change some of the laws that made it easier for candidates of color to run for president, lowering the thresholds for delegates, making delegates proportional, we didn't think that he would be elected president, but lo and behold, Barack Obama was elected president, and it took a generation to get there. So we know that that can be done. We also know that we can overcome barriers like we did in 2020 when Joe Biden was able to be elected despite no Voting Rights Act, despite the talks of a stolen election. That process still was able to get through. It wasn't pretty, as you know, but we got there. And so we just aren't going to have a smooth ride to get to the right place we're trying to get to. But it's still achievable, but we got to have patience and we got to have some energy. And I got a little bit of energy left. I can't say I can just, my wife wants me to start talking about the slowdown. Like when are you going to start turning the corner on all this activism? So it's coming, but it starts with writing a book, laying out all the things that had happened in my experience. This is my perspective only, is not the perspective. If Cedric wrote a book about what happened on the Hill, his will be a little different, I'm sure. But I think the idea is that put your ideas down, do the research, do the hard work, and then target what you're trying to do. Right now, get the Voting Rights Act passed would be great. If we can't get that done, let's get as many people registered as possible. Let's get as much of this stuff exposed as possible. Let's find the good candidates. A lot of these young people are talking about running for office. That's a good thing. But for those of us older, we can certainly still contribute to this work as well.
Also, I understand you started a foundation in Cleveland.
Yeah.
Could you share a little bit about that with the audience?
Yeah, I was the head of the NAACP-National Voter Fund for 17 years. And so my life was real quick in a 30-second window. Student activism in the 80s, Reverend Jackson's 2 campaigns, got connected with John Conyers in the 1990s. But then I went over to the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, and I was able to start doing some work to reform that law. In fact, Donna Brazil, a great friend of mine, asked me to come over and set up the party's first 50-state election protection program at the request of Howard Dean. And the book talks about that. We went to the Katrina situation, what happened there, so we were able to find out how we can sort of help people register to vote if you were not able to vote on election day in your actual precinct. Those kind of landmark things gave me hope that we can keep going and doing this the right way, but it's not the easiest thing to do. You just got to keep working at it.
I guess at this point, I'll kind of open it up to the audience if they have any questions for Greg and ask him about his experience and just maybe some of your own thoughts that you want to share.
Going once. Ooh. Do you have a question?
So who's going to be the first person? Okay.
Thank you. As important as voter registration is voter mobilization. And I've heard folks say that Black turnout is down. I heard Jim Carville on one of these talk shows saying, well, if more black folks had turned out in Florida, Val Demings would have done better. If more black folks had turned out in North Carolina, then that sister would have been, what can we do to increase mobilization, and to what extent are monetary resources essential to mobilization, and where do we turn to? I mean, some say, I heard Donna say, well, when Hillary was running for president, if they had poured more money into the black community, she'd have done better. So there's a lot to do, takes resources to do it. And as we look ahead to this next critical election, 2024, what's the game plan? Where are the resources coming from? And how do we win?
Well, I'm
Pick any one of those questions to answer first.
okay. It's a hard one. Cedric would always give me a hard one. Look, I'm from the old school around how to mobilize voters. It worked for us. We had a 69% turnout of voters in Ohio in 2004. No Obama carried 69% turnout. But we had 300 people on the streets. They knocked on every door in our targeted precinct. When I got to the NAACP Voter Fund, we did 11 voter contacts, 3 knocks at the door, 3 phone calls, 3 pieces of mail, and radio blasting all day. And that's how we got to the turnouts in Detroit and Cleveland and in Florida. Now, I want to talk about Florida a little bit more, but the idea is that we know how to do it, but the new wave of doing things now is not to do the shoe leather. It's to do the TV commercials and do the the text messaging, and it costs money, yeah. But they stopped putting money into the field the way we used to. Now it's starting to come back a little bit. But I saw 69% turn. When Obama ran, it was 70%. So I'm trying to tell you, you can do it with Obama or without. The turnouts in 2020 were great. So I think it's shoe leather, and it's also getting some of this money off of TV and putting it back in the streets where people can do the real work, for sure.
Hey, boss. How does redistricting play into this? We saw with the nonpartisan voting commission in Michigan, we saw the entire state flip. Does our future of voter turnout and voter registration and getting the Voting Rights Act re-implemented ride on getting nonpartisan voting commissions in more states?
Yeah, and again, Michigan did it right, Jared, when they put together an independent commission. We did it wrong in Ohio. I fought for that reform. I helped negotiate it with the legislature in 2018. We went to the ballot and we passed reform, but we let the members of the legislature set up the commission. So they were the redistricting commission. And they did exactly what we hoped they wouldn't do. Even though they increased the number of minority representation in terms of the Democratic Party, they still cooked the books on that, and they basically put themselves back where they now have 60 supermajority, 66, 67% of the legislature in a state that voted 56% Republican, not 67%. So despite our reforms, we lost on that one. California does it right with an independent commission. But this is one of those fights that goes back to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has a case before it called Harper versus Moore. It's going to be decided this term. That's going to challenge this idea of the independent state legislative theory, which these legislators are saying they have the right to basically make the decision, the ultimate decision on what the election laws are, not the Supreme Court's, not the governor. And they want the Supreme Court of the United States to override the ability of anybody to set laws instead of them. So not only do they believe that the 10th Amendment says they should have the only right to determine election law, they feel like the state legislators are the only ones who can make election law changes. Because we were in a pandemic, a lot of changes were made to the election law, and that helped us turn out some numbers. But the reality is that if that Supreme Court in Harper versus Moore were to come back and say, yeah, the legislature has the ultimate authority, they don't have to listen to the state Supreme Court's then we are going to set that clock back even further. Don't forget, we lost Section 4. Section 5 is eviscerated. There's another case, Merrill, I think in Alabama. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to mess it up. Jared is a judge. He can probably figure this out, but I think I saw Keenan Keller walk in. Is that my imagination? Yes. There's some people out here smarter on these kind of issues who can answer that. But these are the kinds of things that the Supreme Court, once again, let me tell you about the court. They stopped the count in Florida when all we were trying to do was count ballots that were uncounted. They came in and knocked down Shelby in 2013. They could come back in 2023 and knock down Section 2 again and put this legislative theory in place. If that happens, then our problem is that we have a three-headed monster, but one of those monsters is compromised. And so we have to think of ways we could deal with the Supreme Court. We only have 9 members, and right now it's 6-3, but it's the Congress has to come back and pass the Voting Rights Advancement Act. It's the Congress has to pass laws that can rebalance this out. And so people in this room who know about that process can speak to it more, but we really need Congress to still act. And we can't let Republicans say, well, we're in charge now. We don't have to do voting rights or civil rights. Yes, you do. And you got to do it right. And we have to keep that pressure on them as well as our Democratic members.
Given the history of origins of the Electoral College, how critical do you think it is to revise the way the Electoral College is run?
Well, thank you for that question, because a good part of this book talks about in detail the problems with 2000, when Gore actually won the popular vote. I mean, he was declared the winner by some of the networks that night. But the fact that we had to go through this process of the Supreme Court stopping them from recounting the votes meant that they intervened. That, you know, if they had kept counting votes in Florida, it would have showed that he had way more, several tens of thousands more votes than Bush. But they artificially stopped those votes from being counted. That was the case of the person who lost the popular vote won. Different question was with Hillary Clinton. She won in fact, Hillary Clinton is the first woman elected president of the United States by the American people. But the Electoral College elected Donald Trump. And so we have to keep reminding people of that America did elect this first woman president. We had a climate activist elected as president in 2000. And these people were not allowed to become president because of the Electoral College. So that's got to be on the list of reforms. I think it may have to take a constitutional amendment. I'm not sure, but that's the kind of thing that we have to get rid of. We can't just fix the Voting Rights Act. We can't just pass For the People Act. We got to get rid of the Electoral College, because that can keep happening. And it could be a situation where we may never be able to reclaim some of this. We don't give the people the right to make that decision. So I strongly support keeping that in there. Or taking it out of the Constitution, actually. Yes, sir.
Get your thoughts on this, but Senator Shelton might have a little dealt with the subject of dark money in politics, and specifically within the Supreme Court, and a lot of what you're talking about right now. How do you see dark money as an influence, and is there a solution to that? It's going to make it easier if money generates the net quite a lot.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. The For the People Act does address this issue, and it's been introduced in Congress. It's like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It still is up against the filibuster. I want to say something about the filibuster before we finish, but the idea is that there is unlimited amounts of money, dark money, coming into the system. Now, I'll be honest with you. There's a lot of dark money coming in all over the place now, and it's everywhere. And we'll never have a fair system as long as that system is in place. Again, who's responsible for that? The United States Supreme Court, 2 decisions, Citizens United and the McCutcheon case in 2014, both put the leash off of big money donors. So they can now put as much money in with no limitations for individual contributions. So we got 3 problems: the Electoral College problem, the Voting Rights Act is not fixed, and there's an unlimited amount of money flowing in from everywhere into these elections. So our democracy is not in trouble because of something Donald Trump did so much is because all these institutional things are collectively have been done. So I am not one of those people who think that our democracy is dying or this is our last presidential election. But I do believe that the institutional things that we're not doing is a bigger threat to democracy as anything those people tried to do on January 6th. If the Congress can't act to get these things done, then it opens up the window for corruption. It opens up the window for manipulation, outside influences coming in, and also elections that aren't trustworthy. If people can't trust the results. You've got to fix these problems one by one, but some of them got to be done at the state level, and some have to be done in the courts, and some have to be done in Congress. But Congress has to do its part, and we have to do our part to keep the pressure on and get that information out to people as much as possible. So it looks bad, but it's fixable. But you need a Congress that's actually awake and dealing with these problems, and not just talking about it as a campaign issue. I'm happy when the Democrats talk about, our democracy dying, but it just can't be the next campaign slogan. It has to be a real strategy for getting bills passed. The reason I thought this book was important, right, because the National Voter Registration Act that passed was not the bill that John Conyers wanted. He wanted same-day registration for everybody every day. We had to get the best we did, and people didn't like the fact that we passed a weaker bill in 1993. But had we not passed that bill in 1994, we lost the House and we lost the Senate. So there would never have been a National Voter Registration Act had we waited for the better bill, same-day registration to happen. By the same token, we had a good bill, the Voting Rights Amendment Act, that was not what everybody wanted, but the difference was that, and people should correct me if I'm wrong, it had a formula for bailing in other states like Ohio and Wisconsin and Missouri and others who were not southern states, but northern states that had records of lawsuits that were failing because they were accused of discriminatory practices. We needed that bill to pass in 2014 to keep from what happened in 2016 and what could easily happen in 2024. So I'm just saying these things because they're all connected to each other, but they really do have to be fixed in some form or fashion before we get to the next election, as much as we can. I'm not giving you much hope, I know, but we got to keep trying.
Keep hope alive.
Keep hope alive, right, right.
This question may to the rights per se, but do you think that we have to have a convention to go over the Constitution?
Make two changes because there's so many loopholes now that people are getting around, and it causes so much consternation. When it comes to voting, just about anything. The states, they're going on a rampage doing their own thing, and they can circumvent a lot of things that could have been taken care of if the Constitution has been upgraded to where we are now. So it's 4 years old or something. Sometimes we need to make some changes.
Yeah.
Because things are getting out of hand. And that just came to my mind a while back. So many things were happening. We're saying, well, we can do this because it's not in the Constitution. It doesn't say shall, will, or so on and so forth. So I just thought I'd bring up that.
No, that's a great question, John, and thank you for doing that. Thank you for your years of service on Capitol Hill as a Capitol Hill policeman. And he's been telling some good stories about the old days, but thank you for that. There's a lot of people thinking about it. In fact, there's a whole crowd, and most of them are on the right and some on the left, who are talking about a constitutional convention. I'm not a fan of that because I don't believe you can ever control it. I think it would have no barriers. It could be a runaway train. We could create things in our Constitution we don't want. And we could lose some of the things we care about the most because who organized their people to get to the convention? So we're not ready for a constitutional convention. If that's the only way we got to do this, I think we need to have a big, long pause and get ourselves together and organize and put the kind of energy and time into that. But others of you may have thoughts on that. But my fear is that there's a process now going through the United States, mostly led by the hard right and some further on the left saying, let's do the Constitutional Convention, try to keep it to just the balanced budget amendment or getting rid of the Electoral College. But my fear is that there's a lot of people who don't like a lot of other things that's in that Constitution that have survived for 250, could survive almost 250 years. If it happens, I just think all of us who are old heads got to stop what we're doing and come back together and help these folks out, because it would not be a easy. It's not like a Democratic convention. It would be the first one we've ever, not the first one we've ever had, but the first one since the Bill of Rights. And I think it would be a very complicated thing to do. But I'm not a constitutional scholar or a lawyer, so I won't. That's just my personal opinion. Anybody got a thought on that?
Greg, following up on the question about the dark money, what do you think? Tell us a little bit what you think about the impact of Citizens United on voting and voting rights in America.
Well, it made it a lot harder for us to compete with some of the bigger money that was coming in. There's some big casino owners out in Las Vegas and others who could just drop $5-6 billion in. It just happened in Ohio. I mean, here's a guy that came out of nowhere, J.D. Vance, and was able to raise all this dark money that came into the state of Ohio, won him the nomination, and it kept going. But he didn't have a lot of grassroots fundraising support in the state of Ohio at all. But dark money is very powerful, and it can come in. So For the People Act is just as important as the John Lewis Act, I believe. We may get a vote on the For the People Act, it seems like from what I'm hearing. We may not get a vote on the John Lewis Act because we have to wait for the Supreme Court rulings. The last thing you want to do is try to fix a bill and then the Supreme Court comes and changes it around again. And you have to go through a whole other process to get that bill reconstructed. So let's get through this court session, see what happens by June, and then do an assessment. And John, that idea of the convention, I hope it doesn't come back up, but God knows that if we're in a situation where all these things are coming at once, it may be something that people have to look at. But right now, I think we're not prepared for it, and it could be a disastrous outcome if we're not in that place yet. That was inspiring.
Well,
That's an inspiring question.
Could you share a little bit more about the For the People Act and what's in it? And
who knows more about the For the People Act? I see some people here who may work that on the Hill. I know it deals with dark money, but I'm not as familiar with it because I'm not on the Hill anymore. But it does deal with corruption. Keenan, can I steal you? I'm so glad you came by. Keenan Keller is the staff director of the House Judiciary Committee, one of John Conyers' top aides, and me and him were running together for years up there, passing all kinds of bills or proposals. Go ahead, Keenan.
So it actually deals with, the For the People Act deals with campaign finance, ethics, and voting rights. Those are the three major components of the legislation. So the voting rights aspect of it is inclusive of what you have in the VRAA, which has sort of worked together. We have the Voting Rights Amendments Act, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. That's now worked into one, and the ethics issue is sort of oddly strangely gone away, but it's actually become something else where the House is now talking about insider trading issues, pension court, Supreme Court ethics issues, and the campaign finance side of things is a slightly different conversation than we were having around the initial introduction of the bill, because now we've discovered that Democrats can actually raise large sums of money also. So the real focus is maintaining our ability to have small money donors still mass money and to be able to speak directly through those kinds of contributions. But those issues are now largely left to members and how they're managing large donors and their small dollar contributions. That's actually how all this kind of changed from the initial time that we first drafted for the bill.
Thank you, Keenan. I appreciate that. How are we doing, Lori? We okay? Okay.
Do you think that it's an oversimplification to say that this resurgence of voter suppression and the gerrymandering and the judicial thing is a response to the changing demographic of America as a whole?
You put your finger right on it. You put your finger right on it. We did it. Everything that I remember from this book, and it'll tell you, it wasn't like it was easy, but we were making progress along the way. You know, those little voter registration drives down south in the 80s, you know, the 5-year battle on Capitol Hill to get one standard for registration, the Help America Vote Act, which set one standard of counting votes and how to do provisional balloting. And then the implementation of that at the state level, the expansion of early voting, absentee, no fault absentee voting, same day registration in many states. That's all been this way. Yes, it's all coming back because the electorate doesn't look like it looked 25 years ago. And it's not gonna look the same way in 25 years from now. It's gonna be a much more diverse group. So these are the growing pains of our democracy, Our democracy is not dying, it's growing. And what's happening is there's a retrenchment against that growth. So this is the last gasp of the people who've controlled things forever, trying to say, no, we can't let you vote in more than one place on election day. I mean, those kind of things are kind of archaic, but that's the last thing they can hold on to. But you can't stop the demographic change the electorate. Now, the Florida situation was our first glimpse. I was in Detroit in 2020. I saw the lines. You all seen lines. People in lines for 9 hours in Ohio and Detroit and Michigan and Florida. That's where it was. National Voter Registration Act, the Help America Vote Act were being fully implemented. When these laws are fully implemented, they work. So the only way to stop that is to undo them. That's why there's so many lawsuits trying to challenge all these bills or portions of it in courts. They couldn't win it at the ballot box. They try to win it at the courts. So yes, this is in response to the growing, changing face of the electorate. And we're part of that changing face. And once we get past this retrenchment area, and when they stop resisting these, the resistance is on their part, not ours. Our democracy is going to continue to grow. So I don't want people to, if there's something I can leave you with that's positive, and I know you're going to ask about something hopeful, is that our democracy is growing, it's getting stronger, but the attacks are getting stronger and the resistance is getting stronger. So that's the fight we're in now. Hopefully it stays civil, but increasingly it's not civil, right? John, it's not civil anymore. What happened January 6th was not civil. And we don't want any more of that. But the fact that we are winning is why there seems to be, so people say, oh, this may be our last election. No, it may be a difficult election, but we got to keep this ball rolling. If we stop fighting, they're going to win. So the thing is, we can't stop fighting. And hopefully when people read this book, they'll see that, okay, well, you can't always get what you want. I forgot who did that song. But it was a good message. We got some things. But had we waited for the perfect, it was the enemy of the good. And so we got some of the good. But God knows, and some of you who were on the Hill at the time know that we had no idea that in 1994, the Republicans would take over the Congress 1 year later. In fact, that was the first time in 40 years Republicans had controlled Congress in 1994, and it's been back and forth since then. So we don't know what's going to happen during these wave elections. So let's get what we can get done. If we can get and this is to people like Keenan, if we can get a manageable bill that we used to be able to rally around, even if it's not everything we need, it's better than having the Supreme Court come in and knock the whole thing down so that it's basically no longer any good. So the court is not on our side this time. This is not the Brown v. Board of Education era anymore. That's part of the problem. And so we now have to stop believing that we can litigate our way out of this. We can organize our way out of it, and we can vote our way out of it. We may not be able to litigate our way out of it, and we certainly may have to step up and do more and not retire so early, and maybe keep fighting a little bit longer until we get this thing on. Sorry, Jane, I didn't mean to say I'm not going to retire soon, but it's coming one day. But we have to at least keep fighting as long as we can.
It's so good to hear that you're hopeful about the survival of our democracy. And I guess in that same vein, what can folks in this room do to protect our democracy and to expand our right to vote?
Well, first of all, you did something big tonight. You came and you stopped what you were doing long to listen, so I appreciate that. Love for you to buy the book, which will be great, and Lori's over here is going to help facilitate that process. For those who have read it, I think Carl and others, I mean, you see there's a lot in here.
A lot in
It's only 230 pages. I cut half of it out, because they took out all my stuff about OU and my student organizing, all my international stuff that I was doing in the 80s. But we had to stop the Cold War and, the Berlin Wall and all that stuff. The Mandela was in jail, so we did all that stuff. What's that? Yeah, book 2 is coming. So I got to do it at some point before I forget about it. Forget what we did. But yeah, I'm hopeful. Keep your energy and your powder dry. There's bigger fights coming. And 2024 is going to be a complicated year. I'm not sure how that's going to go. But what we don't want to do is say to ourselves, our democracy is dying. Or we don't want to say this. If Democrats don't win, our democracy died. No, that's not the case. We don't want to say if we lose, democracy's dead, or we lose, the election was stolen. We don't want to do that. We want to just be able to out-organize everybody and convince people who may know better that it's okay to support voting rights if you're a Republican. It's okay to support diversity if you're a Republican or conservative. It's okay to expand the electorate. It may be uncomfortable, but this is all we have, which is our people. And with the climate problems we're having and the peace and justice issues that have not been resolved, we have to fix them. But if our democracy crumbles, we can't get, the George Floyd bill passed. We can't get climate justice in our country or in our world. And we can't fix immigration. None of those things can be fixed without getting money out of politics and fixing our voting rights laws and strengthening them where we can. So I'm hopeful.
Well, again, keep hope alive, as they say.
Keep hope alive, as Reverend Jackson would say. One more? Yeah.
Greg, perhaps not the constitutional convention, but maybe the congressional convention to clear up some of the problems that they have in Congress.
Problems they have in what?
Congressman-elect Santos.
Yeah.
And there's no way to stop it.
Well, that's democracy at work, too.
People back in this district voted for it.
Yeah.
They're highly upset because it's tired. But Congress has no way of stopping it.
Yeah, there's laws like that I wish we could just get rid of people like that. But, we have to find another way to do that one. But, it was, he's not the first one who lied about their record, by the way, and got elected. But he's a notorious one. I think the guy's sick myself. But I do think that that's got to get resolved by that party. They have to say, okay, this is who you want to represent you. That's not going to work. But yeah, it's not, constitutional, but we have to find ways to make sure our representatives are representative of the people, and they are who they say they are. Any question?
I'm real big on message. And one of the things that I find one party does better than the other is specifically in messaging. Whether we even know what the heck they're talking about, they do a better job. In reference to voting rights and getting more involved, more active. If you don't know right now, you give some thought, well, what would be your simple, carry on message to promote what you're trying to do?
Well, it's a harder question than sure. Yeah, I haven't thought about it enough, but I do know I don't like the message that I see now. I really don't. Here's what, I don't want to say this in the wrong way. I don't want people to get the wrong idea, but I don't want to just keep winning elections because they're saying they're taking our right to vote away. It's a great motivator, but I want the problem to get resolved. I don't want us to talk about our right to vote every election. That shouldn't even be on the list. So let's not say we're going to run another election talking about what they're doing to stop us from voting. We already know that. What are we doing to fix the problem? I would start talking about the expanding democracy or expanding the electorate. That's the message, I think. I think people can absorb a country that's growing and more diverse than they can a partisan message about they taking our right to vote away, because that's a different kind of message. Now, the name of this book originally was Fulfilling the Broken Promise of Democracy. And the publishers at DeGorder did me a favor. They read it and they said, well, really, this is about the Voting Rights Act and what's been done, all the work you did to help fulfill the Voting Rights Act. So this is, you did work beyond the Voting Rights Act. They're struggling with democracy all over the world. And the American democracy experience is one. But this is a struggle that's going on in countries in Europe and Asia, South America, South Africa. And so our democracy battle is not unique to America, but if we're crumbling, if our democracy appears to be crumbling, then it's going to offset all those other democratic reforms that are happening. And so the message is that America's democracy is strong and is growing, and that we are going to be able to expand our democracy to a place where everybody can participate, but we don't believe that our democracy is dying. We believe it's growing, it's strengthening, and we need to work harder to get to that point so that everybody is represented. Not just people with big money, not just people with influence, and not just people in Washington, but people all over the United States can feel it. That's the best I can do. I don't know. I don't have any major skills. Now, Brandon's at NPR over here. I know you grad from Scripps School. He may pick up on some of that, but there's some messaging people here. I hope, I don't tweet a lot, but if you all can start tweeting and putting out messages, that'll help this. But thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Don't forget about the books over here. And they'll continue the conversation and sign some books. So please avail yourself of this opportunity.
And thank you all
Thank you
so
very
much.
much.
I appreciate it. I'd love to sign your book if you buy one. It's only $27. Yeah, it's a bargain basement price. You can't beat it. All right, thanks so much for coming and looking forward to it.